The year of the Uni-Vibe has been extended. This is the Omega-Vibe OV-1 from AXiom Effects. First guitar you heard there was my Reverend Jetstream in the neck position going into the Omega-Vibe. Second guitar was my Reverend East Sider with a JHS Morning Glory after the Omega-Vibe, just to warm it up a little bit. We've seen Uni-Vibes here before, but none with this amount of control, and I'd say dedication to an audio phenomenon before. And we'll get into the deep details in a little bit, but for now, here's what we're working with. We start with your typical volume, speed, and intensity controls, which you find on pretty much any Uni-Vibe pedal, and they work exactly as you'd expect. The primary creation of the Uni-Vibe is its vibrato, and when you mix that together with the original dry signal, that's typically called the chorus effect. The original Uni-Vibe implemented this with push buttons. Most modern Uni-Vibes do it with a toggle switch. This guy here does it with a knob, so you can set your own mix. Between parts tolerances, there being different versions of the Uni-Vibe pedal, and just things drifting over time, there really is no singular textbook Uni-Vibe sound. So Whatever resonates with you, that's how you should set this thing up. Whether you're going after historical accuracy or just something that sounds good to your ear. That flashing blue light down here is not the Uni-Vibe police coming after you for coloring outside the lines and trying something different. Now, you might have also noticed that character switch over here, which goes from 60s to 70s. Uni-Vibe aficionados know that there's a subtle difference between the Uni-Vibes of the 60s and the 70s, namely the amount of low-end response as the oscillation goes around. See if you can hear it here. Now, I know you've been looking up at this bulb section and wondering, when's he going to get around to that? Well, I have a lot to say about it, but I also know how angry people get when I talk too much. So let's get a quick listen to it before I get all chatty. So now we're into the advanced menu kind of stuff. We've got lamp controls, we've got age and bias. Let's start with bias. Now, as you probably know, a lot of the components that we love in audio gear, like tubes, fuzz transistors, bucket brigades, and fuzz and tremolo lamps, they all need fine tuning in order to precisely hit their mark. This amp, like a lot of other all-tube guitar amps, has a knob for ensuring the tubes are getting the exact right amount of voltage. Too low and the amp sounds thin and lifeless. Too much and you're in for a really fun 30 minutes of rockin' before everything burns up and melts and needs to be replaced. The bias here calibrates just how hard we're pushing that bulb, and the difference is pretty easy to hear. You probably know, especially if you watch this channel, that a lot of oscillation-based pedals, tremolos, vibratos, Uni-Vibes, they sometimes make use of a bulb, sometimes an LED, and typically a light-dependent resistor to relay the signal from the oscillator to the filter or the amplifier or whatever. And that's because it imparts a spin on the oscillation signal. It's almost like adding a filter. Between the filament in a bulb taking time to warm up and start producing light, and even more time to dim back down, between the wavelengths of the light being produced over here and the wavelengths which the photoresistor is reactive to, and between the lamp itself being a reactive load, not a fixed load, the shape of the wave becomes lopsided. And now so does the sound of the oscillation. It feels more natural, like it's moving with a purpose. That helps give Uni-Vibe its signature sound, and it's enough that on Josh Scott's Uni-Vibe 101 page, he says, "I think the most important feature of a Uni-Vibe that you need to look for is that it actually includes the light bulb. A Uni-Vibe without that bulb inside is really just a fancy phaser, and let's be real, you don't need a fancy phaser, you need a Uni-Vibe." And if you watch episode 86 of Tone Talk with hosts Mike Hazansky and David Friedman, they talk with Josh Fiden of Voodoo Labs about the Micro-Vibe and how you just can't get that Uni-Vibe sound without the bulb. And it's not for lack of trying. Having a lamp on a board brings additional requirements, complexities, and inconsistencies. Remember how the Electro-Harmonix good vibes wouldn't work unless we use that included special power adapter? That whole bulb thing is a bit of a necessary evil when it comes to Univibes. Well, this is a Univibe without a bulb. It was designed by an electrical engineer who also happens to be a design engineer, who happens to also be a systems engineer, with a bachelor's in physics and applied math, a bachelor's, master's, and a PhD in electrical engineering plus 20 years applied experience, who happens to be obsessed with the sound of the Univibe, particularly cracking that challenge of how to get that sound without a bulb, without compromise. So, ta-da! And since the bulb now lives in circuitry, we can do some pretty interesting stuff like adjusting the bias of that bulb back and forth on the fly. You notice that I started messing around with the intensity knob towards the end there, and that's because there's definitely some overlapping ground in terms of what the intensity and the bias adjustments do. And I really like how they complement one another and kind of shape what the bulb is doing in there. Now, right next to the bias knob, we've got the age knob, and that's because as a bulb gets older, the thermal response starts to degrade. And this is pretty subtle, but you can definitely hear the waveform response start to change as we age and then renew the bulb. For the longest time, I just assumed that Univibe just wasn't an effect that was for me, because every time I tried it out, I thought it sounded like a watered-down vibrato or some sort of unholy hybrid between a chorus, a phaser, and a tremolo. But I was basing that opinion entirely on these effect pedals with a Univibe mode. So they were Univibe in the same way that this artificial flavoring is banana. It's close enough that people can be convinced that it's good enough if it's cheap enough and convenient enough. It wasn't until I started trying out actual dedicated Univibe pedals like the Good Vibes, the Micro Vibe, the Soul Vibe, and the Depths. That's when I realized that this effect really is its own thing. And there are a ton of historical and technical videos you can watch on Univibe. I think this really represents what can happen when your knowledge and your skills and your passion overlap and form this kind of Voltron of accomplishments. It's a wonderful thing when you get to that point. At the very least, you need to visit the webpage. Casey very much writes like an engineer and a historian and not someone from marketing, and I find that really refreshing. As for my own favorite settings, well, after hours and hours of noodling, I kind of gravitated to this. New bulb, 50-50 mix, 60s character, a bump up on the intensity and a bump down on the speed, bias around 10 o'clock. I'm so excited that I get to bring this one to you. It's a fantastic achievement. It's pedalboard friendly, and so am I. So keep on playing, keep on inventing, and I'll catch you on the next one.